The courtroom was warmer than usual that day, not hot, just warm enough to make people shift in their seats, tug at their collars, and in spoken discomfort clinging to the air. Jasmine Crockett stood at the defense table, one hand resting lightly on a stack of folders, the other hanging at her side. Calm, sharp, not a wrinkle on her gray slacks, not a bead of sweat on her brow, and her gaze never left Judge Randall Forrester's. The moment he raised his voice, the room tensed. "Miss Crockett," he said, his tone rigid, "this court does not entertain political speeches disguised as legal arguments. You've been warned once. If you continue down this path, I will find you in contempt." She didn't flinch. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this isn't politics. It's precedent, and I'm asking this court to recognize the difference." Forrester leaned back in his chair, his lips pressed into a line. He was a man known for two things, his short patience and his long memory. He eyed her like someone who'd just been told their favorite rule was being bent. "You've been practicing law long enough to know better," he said. $500 contempt of court. The fine hit the room like a slap. A few gasps, some murmurs, but Jasmine didn't move. The bailiff scribbled on a notepad. The court clerk paused, glanced up. A young law student in the back whispered to his friend, "Did she just get fined for citing case law?" Jasmine cleared her throat calmly. "Then I respectfully request the court's rationale for the fine so it may be reviewed as part of the appellate record." Forrester blinked. He wasn't used to being questioned, at least not like this. From the bench, he could usually smell fear. But Jasmine wasn't afraid. Her tone was measured. Her eyes were focused. Her voice was steady. "Excuse me," he said, more a challenge than a question. "You fined me for contempt," she replied. "I'm asking for the court's reasoning so it can be entered into the record should it be necessary for review." He shifted in his chair. You could almost hear the tension hum in the silence. A few feet away, the prosecutor, Leland Briggs, a by-the-book type, flipped through his own notes with theatrical slowness as if to say, "Not my problem." He didn't look up. "You're bordering on disrespect," the judge warned. "And you're bordering on suppressing a valid defense," Jasmine shot back. Still calm, still measured. "I'm not raising my voice. I'm not making speeches. I'm quoting federal case law and asking the court to hear the facts. If that's contempt, then we've all lost something bigger than $500. Someone exhaled loudly in the gallery. A nervous laugh. Then silence again. Judge Forrester stared at her for a long moment. His mouth moved like he was about to speak. Then stopped. "Move on," he said finally, "before I make it 1,000. But that didn't stop the shift in the room. Because something had happened. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't backed down. And somehow, without raising her voice, she'd made everyone sit up. The judge looked irritated, but also slightly unsure. That rare moment when someone in authority feels a crack forming under their feet and isn't quite sure if it's coming from their own misstep or the person standing in front of them. But before he could regain control of the room, Jasmine turned the page and what came next was going to rattle more than just the courtroom. 2 days earlier, Jasmine sat in a modest corner office on the second floor of a law firm in downtown Dallas. Not one of those glass towers with fancy views and espresso machines. Just a beige building with creaky floors and file cabinets that still used keys. She was on the phone, pacing slowly in flats that had seen more courtroom floors than fashion runways. "Who's the arresting officer?" she asked, pen tapping against her notepad. "Officer Trent Walsh," came the voice on the other end. "Pulled 6 protesters out of a sedan outside the Northern Star Oil building. Charged them with unlawful assembly and trespassing. Were they violent? Nope. One of them was a high school teacher. The rest were in their 20s. They were reading statements out loud, sitting on the steps." Jasmine stopped pacing. "Reading statements? Yeah, the whole thing's on video. A guy live-streamed it on Facebook." She ran her hand down her face. She'd seen this pattern before. Corporate building, private security gets nervous, calls the police. Charges get thrown on the books to scare people into staying quiet. But this one felt sloppy. "I'll take it," she said. "You sure? No one else touched it." They're calling it a waste of court time. They've said that before. By the end of that day, she had 6 case files spread out across her desk. Each protester charged the same way. Same arrest report, copy-pasted with different names. No statements from the actual building staff, just a rushed affidavit and a few grainy screenshots. But one detail stuck out. Officer Walsh claimed he gave 3 loud verbal warnings before making arrests. On the video, though, he barely got through the first warning before yanking someone to their feet. That someone? Marissa Elkins, local art teacher, wore cat eye glasses and carried a sketch pad in her purse. On video, she doesn't even look up before Walsh's hand grabs her wrist. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, the video paused on her screen. She knew this case wouldn't make headlines. But it mattered, not just because people were arrested for sitting and speaking, but because the system was counting on no one paying attention. That's why she didn't hesitate to step into the courtroom this morning. She'd done her research, pulled city ordinances, dug up 2 federal cases that matched the situation almost to the letter. But what she hadn't counted on was Judge Forrester. He wasn't just strict, he was dismissive, the kind who believed protests were loud nonsense and thought civil rights arguments belonged in dusty textbooks, not active courtrooms. Before proceedings began, he barely looked at her, barely acknowledged her clients. When she introduced herself, he muttered, "We'll keep this quick." Quick meant quiet. Quick meant don't make a scene. Jasmine never made scenes. She made arguments. By the time court resumed that afternoon, the energy in the room had changed. It wasn't dramatic, just quieter. People leaned forward instead of back. They weren't there for fireworks. They were waiting to see what Jasmine would do next. Judge Forrester entered with the same stiff posture and pursed lips as always, but his eyes briefly flicked toward her, just a flick, quick, but there. Jasmine stood before the bench, her notes in one hand, her other resting lightly on the table. Her voice didn't need volume, it had weight. "Your Honor," she began, "we're not here to dispute property boundaries or vandalism." My clients sat on concrete steps. They read statements. There was no force, no damage. They didn't even block access to the building. They were arrested because someone didn't like what they were saying. Forrester cut her off. "Miss Crockett, we are not here to retry the arresting officer's discretion. You are here to argue the merits of the motion to dismiss." "I am, Your Honor," she said, still calm, "and the merits are rooted in the First Amendment, reinforced by Martin v. City of Stroud, and more recently Holder v. Community Network." His eyes narrowed. That last case, Holder, was obscure, barely cited. Most attorneys didn't even reference it because it came from an appellate ruling in Indiana. But Jasmine had found a key overlap. "Your point?" he asked, voice low. In Holder, the court ruled that protesters arrested outside a private office building could not be charged with trespass when the building operated on publicly accessible grounds. Same setup here. The front steps of Northern Star's headquarters are not gated. They're open to pedestrian traffic and business visitors. The judge sat back, folding his arms. "So now we're applying rulings from Indiana?" She nodded. "Not applying, drawing a parallel. Because when states start to mirror each other in how they respond to peaceful assembly, it becomes a pattern worth acknowledging." The prosecutor, Leland Briggs, sighed loudly. "Your Honor, this is a stretch. These people broke the law, plain and simple." Jasmine turned to face him. "Mr. Briggs, did you watch the video footage of the arrests?" He shifted in place. "The department provided incident reports. So you haven't seen the video?" "That's not relevant." "Respectfully, it is. Because the arrest report says Officer Walsh issued 3 warnings. The video shows him barely giving one before grabbing Miss Elkins by the arm. No crowd control order. No PA system. Just his voice in a noisy street, and even that, he didn't wait to finish." Forrester flipped through the paperwork in front of him but stopped midway. His eyes lingered on one document longer than the others. "Officer Walsh is not present for testimony today," he said. No, sir, Jasmine answered. The department said he's on leave, stress-related. Briggs cut in. He's a decorated officer, and he made an error. Jasmine interrupted, her voice still even. But this isn't about blaming him. It's about correcting the result of that error. For a split second, the room was still again. Forrester exhaled slowly through his nose. His face didn't change, but the delay said more than his expression ever could. He was processing it. He wasn't agreeing, not yet, but he was listening. Briggs tried one more jab. She's turning this into a political sideshow. Jasmine didn't even look at him. This isn't a show. This is my clients' lives. They were threatened with criminal records over a silent protest on open steps. If that's the system working, then we need to ask who it's working for. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was uncomfortable. Forrester glanced back at the fine he'd issued earlier that morning. You could tell he was beginning to realize it wasn't just excessive, it was reactive. But what he didn't know yet was that Jasmine hadn't even played her strongest card. Not yet. Jasmine flipped to the final page of her notes. Her fingers barely touched the paper, but her voice carried every ounce of weight it needed. There's one more case I'd like to introduce into the record, she said, scanning the courtroom without raising her voice. Donovan vs. Metro PD, 9th Circuit, 2016. Judge Forrester raised an eyebrow. That was dismissed on procedural grounds. It was, Jasmine nodded. But the language used by the appellate court in their opinion established a standard, one that aligns with what happened here. Briggs scoffed. Now reciting case language from a case that didn't even proceed? It's not the outcome I'm citing, she said, turning toward him calmly. It's the court's interpretation of how officers handle protests on publicly accessible private property. The court warned against vague orders and reactive policing, which, Your Honor, is exactly what Officer Walsh did. Forrester leaned forward, elbows on the bench, suddenly more alert. You're telling me a single paragraph in a dismissed case should override current Texas law? No, she said. I'm telling you that the law isn't just about punishment. It's about protection. And when we let weak cases slide by with a rubber stamp, we normalize sloppy arrests. Then suddenly, anyone standing outside with a sign becomes a criminal, even if they're reading from a notebook quietly on a public sidewalk. Briggs folded his arms. He was losing the thread, and he knew it. But Jasmine kept going. She walked slowly toward the front of the room, stopping just short of the jury box. My client Daryl has heart problems. He sat down to protest because standing too long could send him back to the ER. He said nothing, made no threats. The officer didn't ask questions, just grabbed him. Same with Marissa, dragged by her wrist like she was resisting. She wasn't. She was reading a quote from Dr. King when he pulled her up. She paused and looked over at the judge. Your Honor, I know this courtroom has seen worse crimes. I know there are bigger cases. But if the justice system can't take these small moments seriously, moments where people are punished simply for being visible, then what's the point of any of this? Judge Forrester didn't respond right away. His eyes dropped to the file on his desk, but it was clear he wasn't reading. Something in the way he leaned back said he was stalling for time, thinking through every word she had just laid out. The silence stretched long enough for a cough to echo from the back of the room. Jasmine stayed still. She knew that silence. She knew when to push, and when to let the weight of truth hang heavy in the room. Finally, Forrester cleared his throat. Motion to dismiss will be taken under advisement. He didn't look at her when he said it, but he didn't challenge her either. It wasn't a victory, not yet. But it was ground gained. As Jasmine packed her files, a few people in the gallery made eye contact with her. Just brief, wordless acknowledgments. Outside the courthouse, the autumn light was soft and low. Her client stood by the steps, waiting. Marissa Elkins, the teacher, clutched a binder to her chest like a shield. Daryl leaned against a railing, visibly tired but watching her with the kind of patience that said he'd been fighting systems his whole life. She nodded to them, a quiet reassurance that the day wasn't wasted. That night, Jasmine sat in her apartment, surrounded by open files and highlighter-streaked statutes. She was exhausted, not from shouting or chaos, but from the stillness of pushing against resistance without moving an inch backward. Her phone buzzed. A message from an old law professor. Saw the clip. That judge underestimated you. Well done. She smiled faintly. Then another message. This one from a reporter. Any chance you'll comment for a piece we're doing on protest rights and misuse of authority? She didn't reply. Not yet. The next day, things escalated. The courtroom was fuller than usual. Word had gotten out. Someone had leaked a portion of the video. Walsh's aggressive arrest, Marissa's shocked expression, the missing warnings. It had gone viral overnight. Jasmine walked into the room knowing eyes were on her, but she didn't shift her posture, didn't perform. She sat, opened her binder, and waited. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Forrester appeared more rigid than the day before, his robe slightly wrinkled, like he hadn't slept well. His voice, though calm, carried an edge of defensiveness. Before we begin, he said, this court would like to address the recent public attention regarding this case. The gallery hushed. It is the opinion of this bench that legal proceedings must remain free from media influence or public pressure. Therefore, no further video footage will be considered unless entered formally into evidence. Jasmine raised her hand calmly. Your Honor, I filed a motion this morning to admit the video under Evidentiary Rule 401 and 403. He raised an eyebrow. Already? She nodded. Time is precious, and I had a feeling we'd be here again. The prosecutor objected, of course. Called it prejudicial. Claimed it misrepresented the context. But Jasmine had anticipated that. She had already prepared timestamps, transcripts, and statements from 2 independent observers who had witnessed the arrests and submitted affidavits. The judge glanced at the file she had handed over. For a moment, he didn't say a word. Then, with a reluctant nod, he admitted the video into evidence. The lights dimmed slightly as the court technician played the footage on the overhead monitor. Silence fell across the room. Officer Walsh appeared, barking something unintelligible. The camera shook slightly. Then, in full view, he lunged for Marissa without completing his so-called third warning. Her startled expression, the dropped sketchbook. Daryl, barely visible, was already sitting, palms open on his lap, when another officer pushed him to the ground. Someone in the gallery gasped. Jasmine didn't look around. She kept her eyes on the judge. When the video ended, no one spoke. Even Briggs shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Forrester's jaw worked back and forth before he finally said, "Counsel, you may proceed." Jasmine stood, calm, grounded. The court now has evidence that contradicts the official arrest reports. That's a serious matter. My clients are being prosecuted based on false premises, and this footage proves it. She let that settle before continuing. I ask the court not to look away. Not because this is dramatic or viral, but because if we don't hold the truth up in moments like this, we teach every future officer and judge that documentation doesn't matter. That stories don't matter. That voices can be erased because the paperwork says something different. Judge Forrester adjusted his glasses. He looked like a man who'd been expecting to bulldoze through a routine case and now found himself standing in the middle of a reckoning. Briggs tried to salvage it. Your Honor, the department has reviewed the incident and found no wrongdoing. Jasmine countered before the judge could reply. No wrongdoing? She picked up the sketchbook Marissa had dropped. This was in the police evidence locker. A sketchbook, with notes, quotes, and peaceful messages. No signs, no threats, no megaphones, and it was treated as evidence of a crime. She placed it on the table, soft and deliberate. The courtroom was silent again. Jasmine looked directly at the bench. We don't need a revolution to fix what's broken. Sometimes, all it takes is someone refusing to look away. The judge said nothing. But the court clerk, sitting just behind him, paused her typing, just long enough to feel the weight of what had been said. The next morning, the courthouse felt different. The sidewalk buzzed with quiet anticipation. Not the frenzy of reporters, but the heavy hum of people who had started to care. A young man in a button-down shirt stood near the courthouse steps, phone in hand, refreshing his feed. The video had spread. Overnight, the footage of Officer Walsh's hasty arrests had traveled far beyond the Dallas legal community. Civil rights groups had shared it. Law professors had commented on it. Even a retired judge had reposted it with the caption, "This isn't how you handle peaceful dissent." Inside the building, Jasmine Crockett sat in the hallway outside Courtroom 3C. She wasn't looking at her phone. She didn't need to. Her focus was squarely on the documents in her lap. One last case citation. One handwritten note she wanted to add. One phrase she wanted to adjust in her closing. She didn't do drama. She did details. And right now, every detail mattered. Across the hall, Marissa Elkins sat between two of the other defendants. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap, but she looked up every so often to catch Jasmine's eye. Jasmine offered a small nod. No smile. Just a silent signal. "We're not done yet." When the bailiff called her name, she stood, calm as ever, and entered the courtroom. Judge Forrester was already seated. This time, his gaze met hers as she approached. Not the hard glare of yesterday. Something more searching, cautious, human. He tapped his fingers once on the wood before him. "We are reconvening on docket number 22-1473, State vs. Elkins et al." Jasmine stood tall, ready for the court, Your Honor. Forrester glanced at the prosecution's table. Briggs, for once, didn't look smug. He looked tired. "Miss Crockett," the judge began, "before we proceed, I have reviewed the affidavits, the video evidence, and the supplemental citations your office submitted overnight." He paused. "I'm particularly interested in the footage from the second camera angle, taken from across the street." Jasmine's heart thumped once in her chest, hard, but her face gave nothing away. "Yes, Your Honor. That angle provides a clearer sequence of events, including the timestamp." Forrester nodded. "Indeed. It also confirms that the protest did not block building access, did not damage property, and did not interfere with operations." He looked directly at Briggs. "Is that still contested by the state?" Briggs shifted in his seat. "The state maintains that." "Answer the question, Counselor." "No, Your Honor. The facts of the footage are not in dispute." Forrester turned back to Jasmine. "Proceed with your argument." She stepped forward. Her voice was steady, low, deliberate. "Your Honor, we do not dispute that the building was private property. We do not dispute that the officers were responding to a tenant's call. What we dispute is the escalation, the speed, the absence of clear warnings, and the criminalization of speech that was both peaceful and constitutionally protected." She held up a copy of Donovan v. Metro PD. In that decision, the Ninth Circuit made it clear, when police respond to protest on publicly accessible property, they are required to issue clear, audible, and repeated warnings before taking enforcement action. Officer Walsh failed to do that. She moved toward the bench, not too close. "Just enough. But even more troubling, Your Honor, is the fact that this arrest appears to have been made not to prevent disruption, but to silence discomfort. There is a difference. One is enforcement, the other is suppression." Her words hung in the room like smoke. Forrester sat back. "Miss Crockett, are you implying the department acted on political motivation?" Jasmine didn't blink. "I'm saying when enforcement becomes reactive to speech rather than behavior, it's no longer neutral. And that is not speculation, Your Honor. That is precedent." The room was still. Then Briggs stood. "Your Honor, the defense is painting with too broad a brush." Officer Walsh made a judgment call. Perhaps it was flawed, but that does not mean these individuals didn't violate the law. Forrester raised an eyebrow. "And yet the affidavit from the building's management clearly states that no interference occurred. No request for removal. No complaint from staff." He leaned forward. "So I ask again, Mr. Briggs, on what basis did Officer Walsh determine that arrest was necessary?" Briggs looked at the floor. The officer believed the protest posed a potential security risk. Potential, Forrester repeated. Not actual, not documented, not reported. Briggs swallowed hard. Correct. The judge looked down at his notes for a long time. Then he closed the folder. I've seen enough. A murmur stirred in the gallery. Forrester held up a hand. This court is dismissing all charges against the defendants in case 22-1473. Furthermore, I am ordering the expungement of their arrest records and a formal inquiry into Officer Walsh's conduct to be filed with Internal Affairs. The silence broke. Darrell put his head in his hands. One of the college students whispered, "Oh my God." Jasmine didn't move. Not yet. Forrester turned to her. "Miss Crockett, your defense was well argued. Precise. I may not agree with every assertion, but I cannot deny the strength of your presentation. The court thanks you." Jasmine nodded once. "Thank you, Your Honor." She turned to her clients. They were rising now, slow but sure. Some hugged, some cried, but none of them felt small anymore. As she gathered her folders, Judge Forrester added, almost as an afterthought, "Miss Crockett, if ever you consider seeking a judicial appointment." She paused at the door. "I'm not done arguing cases yet, Your Honor." His lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Then keep doing it like this." Outside the courtroom, reporters waited, but Jasmine didn't stop. Not for questions, not for flashes, not for praise. She had another case waiting, another file to open, another moment where someone's voice needed defending. And that night, across Dallas, the video kept playing. Not the arrest, not the protest, but her voice. Calm, measured, steady. A voice that didn't shout. A voice that didn't bend. A voice that said, "This matters." Weeks passed, but the ripples didn't fade. The dismissal of charges made headlines in local papers. Blogs picked it up. One national outlet ran the headline, "The lawyer who made silence louder than a shout." But Jasmine Crockett wasn't reading coverage. She was still working, still showing up early to courtrooms where no cameras waited, defending people no one else would. Her phone was full of unanswered interview requests. Her inbox crowded with messages from law students, single mothers, first-time protesters, even a retired Marine who wrote, "I didn't know I needed that moment until I watched you stand your ground." But she hadn't done it for recognition. She hadn't done it to trend. She did it because the system was counting on her not to. One Friday evening, she sat in her office long after sunset. The building creaked with emptiness, the hum of an old vending machine the only sound left. Outside her window, Dallas blinked in scattered lights. She opened her drawer and pulled out Marissa's sketchbook. The teacher had left it with her after the trial, said she wanted Jasmine to have it. Inside were soft pencil drawings of courthouse pillars, protest signs, and people's eyes. Page after page of humanity captured not in anger, but in quiet. On the final page, a quote. "Sometimes the bravest voice in the room is the one that doesn't rise, but refuses to lower." Jasmine ran her thumb across the edge of the page, then closed the book. She didn't need speeches. She needed resolve. The next morning, she took on a new client, an undocumented teen caught in a school raid, terrified into silence. The day after that, a woman who'd been fired for reporting workplace abuse. Different cases, same patterns. People pushed aside, hoping someone would speak when they couldn't. She knew the judge in this new case. He was another Forrester type. And that didn't bother her. It meant the work mattered. In court, she stood with her client. When the judge tried to redirect the narrative, she gently pulled it back. When the opposing counsel tried to dismiss it as emotion, she answered with case law. When someone tried to cut her off, she let the pause speak louder than their interruption. Again and again, she wielded something far sharper than outrage, clarity. The viral moment, the court confrontation, Judge Forrester's reluctant respect, it all faded into the background. Jasmine Crockett had never been interested in being remembered for one day. She was building something slower, stronger. Legacy didn't need lights. It needed consistency. One by one, Her wins didn't always look like headlines, but they looked like justice. A drop charge here, a reversed decision there, a policy changed after pressure. A room full of eyes that, once disinterested, now watched carefully. And behind it all, one woman. Calm, focused, unshaken. A young girl once watched Jasmine argue a case from the back row. After the session, she approached her in the hallway and said, "I want to talk like you someday." Jasmine bent down, smiled, and replied, "You already do. You just need to stop letting people talk louder than your truth." That girl would go home and write her first letter to a law school 3 years early. This wasn't just about one courtroom, one moment, one judge. It was about what happens when someone refuses to shrink. When someone takes a system built on hierarchy and reminds it that presence can't be silenced. Jasmine Crockett never raised her voice. But in doing so, she raised the standard. And far beyond Dallas, in homes and classrooms and offices and corners of the internet where stories still mattered, people replayed that moment. The way she stood, the way she spoke, the way she didn't blink. And in that stillness, they found a kind of power they hadn't known belonged to them, too.